11 minutes after it was announced in Tel Aviv, President Harry S. Truman led the American government into formal recognition of a new Jewish state, the State of Israel. It was in that moment, against the advice of his own Secretary of State, that in 1948, Harry Truman stepped into history, giving stature and credibility to the infant nation at its most critical moment. Today, we'll talk to presidential historian and Grove City College professor Paul Kengor about what it took for an American president like Harry Truman to become perhaps the most important friend of Israel. As a man, Harry Truman was notoriously stubborn. He could be quick-tempered, famously writing and never mailing letters to those who had offended him to blow off steam. He was emotional, sizing up everyone from foreign leaders to Missouri party bosses by his personal assessment of their character, and he often got it right. So when Truman decided that recognizing a new Jewish state was the right thing to do, no amount of public or private pressure would sway the man from independence. That's why minutes after Israel's founder and first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, read their Declaration of Independence, just 979 words in length, White House spokesman Charlie Ross made it official. The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel. When he left the presidency, he was asked why he did it. Why did he risk the wrath of anti-Semitic opponents and politicians in his own party? Here was how the president answered. Watch this.
1549.
But don't think that decision to recognize Israel is an easy one. I had to make a compromise with the Arabs and divide Palestine. The Jews wanted to chase all the Arabs into the Tigris and Euphrates River, and the Arabs wanted to chase all the Jews into the Red Sea. And what I was trying to do was to find a homeland for the Jews and still be just with the Arabs. But when you go into a thing of that kind, the people you help most are the ones that get most angry with you. Both of them were against me on the situation, but as President of the United States, I paid no attention to them, carried out what I thought was right, and I had the support of the Congress, and I could do it, which is unusual in these days.
Could you tell us specifically that a lot of Jewish people were against you too?
Oh, well, there were a lot of Jewish people against me because they wanted the whole of Palestine. As I say, they wanted to drive all the Arabs into the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Paul Kengor, welcome back to State of Independence. First, when you see that clip of President Truman reflecting on his decision to recognize Israel, he answers in his trademark, direct, matter-of-fact way, almost as if it's obvious to everyone that this was the best way to keep the peace. Everyone most certainly didn't agree, and Truman himself wasn't always a champion of an independent home for the Jewish people. So what was the backstory here?
Yeah, well, first, let me thank you, Joe, for doing this. I mean, this is the kind of thing that people don't talk about on television anymore. And I mean, this is obviously historically extremely important. And that's the first time I've seen Truman in that clip. I've seen the larger clip before, parts of it, and it almost looks like he's reading off of a teleprompter, right? He's kind of speaking kind of plainly and methodically and almost, complete sentences. But as you can see there, the interviewer jumped in and asked him a question. So it's a give and take, but he was very precise in his words. He was very intelligent. I mean, for somebody seen as this, farmer haberdasher, right? A guy who ran a men's clothing shop in Independence, Missouri. Truman was often seen as uneducated and so forth, but he was very sophisticated. He, among other things, I thought as you were doing the intro, he could be rough with people. He became an aficionado of music, classical music. And when his daughter did a performance and his daughter was panned by the music critic for, I think, the Washington Post, Harry Truman wrote a letter to him saying that he was going to come there and punch him in the nose. so that's the kind of thing that he did. But there's so much background to this. I guess I should back up a little bit by saying that Truman's predecessor, FDR, was opposed.
Now, wasn't FDR the guy who turned back a boat? Wasn't there weren't Jewish people in a boat trying to come into the United States? Otherwise, they would have been sent back to Europe and maybe die in the concentration camps. And FDR wouldn't let the boat land?
That's exactly right. In fact, they got as close to the United States. The boat got to Havana. And so, of course, that was when Batista was in charge of Cuba prior to Castro. And so Cuba was a close ally. It wasn't a communist dictatorship. They could quite literally see the lights of Miami, and they were turned back. And more recently, there have now been a number of really good books on FDR and Israel and Jews. I don't know if I could quite go so far as to say that he was anti-Semitic, but he was not pro-Israel. He was not pro-Zionist. Zionism meaning the movement to create a Jewish home, Jewish nation state in Palestine. He was completely against that. There was a recent book that came out by my late friend Stan Evans. I guess it had been probably almost maybe 10 years ago now. And Stan published it before he died. There's a paper in there from one of the final conferences, and Stan found this in Edward Stettinius's Secretary of State to FDR's private papers in University of Virginia, where FDR says to Stalin, where he talks about his proposal to send American Jews to Saudi Arabia, of all things.
Wow.
And that document, I share it with my students in my Middle East politics course. I say, look, we don't know exactly what the guy meant by this. It was later in his life. I mean, was the guy joking? Was he starting to lose it a little bit? I don't know, but it's very disturbing. And you see nothing like that at all from Truman. So I'll quote one person here, David Niles, who was probably considered the most pro-Zionist assistant that Truman had. He didn't have many of them. David Niles was Jewish. By the way, David Niles was terrible on communism, really bad on that one. But Niles has this great quote where he said, had Franklin Roosevelt lived, I have serious doubts that the nation of Israel would have come into being.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a powerful statement.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's how significant the switch was.
Well, for a lot of our viewers, especially younger ones, they may not know that about the number of displaced Jews after the Second World War. I mean, Hitler obviously killed 6 million Jews in concentration camps. And everybody, most people know about that. Everybody should know about it, so it doesn't ever happen again. But that being
the DPs, the displaced persons.
Yeah. But how many were there? And obviously they were displaced because they had no place to go.
Right.
So, but were there thousands or a million or do we know? I mean, there was a big number.
Yeah, many thousands. I'll put it that way. There were probably about 10 to 13 million Jews alive in the world by the end of World War II. Well, actually, I got to back up. Hitler killed 6 million Jews, right? And there had been about 13 million. So Hitler killed quite literally almost half the Jews in the world. And the majority at that point were actually living in the United States. In fact, for the longest time, and this still might be true, Joe, there have been more Jews in New York City than in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. So there were, and most Jews then in the 1930s were in Poland. I mean, that's why the Warsaw Ghetto was set up there. It's one of the reasons that Hitler went into Poland and did what he did with the Jews in Poland. They were in Russia. They were in the Ukraine. David Ben-Gurion and all these different leaders, they were all born in Eastern Europe, in places like Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania. I mean, Ben Netanyahu is unusual in being a Jewish prime minister who was actually born in Israel.
Right.
Many weren't. So there were many thousands, possibly millions of DPs at that point. Ronald Reagan's kind of first major political campaign that he was ever involved in 1946, 1947 as an actor was to help fight for the DPs.
Right.
So
and Reagan supported Truman, by the way. I mean, I think he campaigned for Truman. Do you think it was because of that, because of Truman's stance on Israel? Do you think that had any kind of a role?
A number of different issues. And at that point, Reagan was still a registered Democrat. And Reagan at that point, too, had become vehemently anti-communist. And Harry Truman, by that point, 1947-48, was staunchly anti-communist. In fact, Truman launched the Marshall Plan and then the Truman Doctrine, both around June 1947. He called those two halves of the same walnut. And they were about containing the Soviet Union, stopping the spread of the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe. So at that point, Reagan was firmly behind Harry Truman.
Right, right. Obviously, Ronald Reagan went on to become one of our great presidents, and as a Republican of all things. But he was clearly behind Harry Truman in 1947 and 1948. What was the prevailing American view at the time that Harry Truman made this decision? Obviously, there are people in his own cabinet who did not want him to support this new state. But what was the prevailing American viewpoint in 1947 and 1948 about a Jewish state, state of Israel?
Well, it's a good question, and there weren't reliable polls, right? In fact, a great Harry Truman story was that when he was up for re-election in 1948, there were no reliable polls as to whether or not he could win. And David McCullough, who wrote the best book on Harry Truman, talks about a poll that was done by one of the major newspapers, New York Herald Tribune or something like that, where they surveyed the top 100 most noted political columnists in the country, and all but maybe one or two said that Thomas Dewey would win. Right. And so that was about as scientific as polling got. And I think it was the Chicago Tribune. It was one of the Chicago papers that printed early.
That's correct.
And there's that
famous picture of Truman holding up the newspaper saying that Dewey wins.
Yeah, which is amazing. I mean, they were that confident. So no one really knows, but I can tell you this, the vast majority of the leading people in Truman's cabinet were against Israel, creating the nation state of Israel. That included the man who was known as the most respected man in Washington, George Marshall, Truman's Secretary of State.
Marshall was against it.
Marshall was against it. Marshall was against it. And Marshall was respected even by Truman. There's a great story where one of Truman's aides came to Truman and said, Marshall's really against this. And by the way, I hate to tell you this, Mr. President, but there's a lot of people that think that George Marshall ought to be president. And Truman said, I wish that George Marshall was president. he said, but you're stuck with me, right? And I'm going to make the final decision on this. Marshall was vehemently against it. James Forrestal, who was the first Secretary of Defense, so DOD had just been started by Truman's National Security Act of 1947. That was our first wartime Defense Department. Prior to that, it had been the War Department during World War II. He was against it, and frankly, Joe, Marshall and Forrestal, they had good reason. I mean, they knew the Arabs promised. They said, if you recognize the nation state of Israel, quote, we will push the Jews into the sea. I mean, it could have been a bumper sticker, right? We will push the Jews into the sea. We guarantee you that we will invade, which is exactly what they did. I mean, the minute that Israel was formally recognized, the Arab states invaded from all sides. And so Marshall said, we can't have that. We're trying to win a Cold War against the Soviets. Middle East oil was in jeopardy. They were trying to formulate NATO. They had the Marshall Plan going, everything else. Stalin was in the Middle East. So Marshall and Forrestal and the others said, we're completely against this. In a really tense cabinet meeting, Marshall said to Truman, he said, Mr. President, if you go forward in recognizing the nation state of Israel, I will not be able to support you in your re-election for President of the United States. Wow. And Clark Clifford, the future Secretary of Defense, who was sitting there, said, I couldn't believe it. He said, I never heard anybody talk to the President of the United States that way. And Truman, when it was over, said, wow, that was tough as a cob. He was an old farmer, right? Cob. And he said that was tough as a cob. He was sweating when he was in that room. But that's the kind of authority that Marshall had. And Marshall thought, Truman, you're trying to do this to win the Jewish vote. That's why you're doing this.
Wow.
And that wasn't the case. Wow. And in fact, I know you want to get to this. What was really motivating Truman above all, if it wasn't the Jewish vote, if it wasn't foreign policy, was frankly his faith. That was most significant.
Wow. So he was somebody who, he was an avid Bible reader, I know, which puts him in a special category among U.S. presidents. But also there were a couple of other names of people. Eddie Jacobson
right.
and Dr. Chaim Weizmann. Who were they, and why were they so important to Truman?
Oh, you know your stuff. All right, I'm going to read you one quote first, all right? So this is from Clark Clifford, who became Secretary of Defense. And Clark Clifford and David Niles were probably the only two pro-Israel people around Truman at the time. And he said this. This is quite a testimony. That's why I want to read it, exact words. Truman's own reading of ancient history in the Bible, made him a supporter of the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, even when others who were sympathetic to the plight of the Jews were talking of sending them to places like Brazil, right? And that would have been FDR among them. So Eddie Jacobson was an old Jewish business partner of Harry Truman. And I should say here, a lot of people will say, but wasn't Truman anti-Semitic? Look at some of these statements from Truman using words like, Hebrews and I don't know if I should say it on the air, but it starts with K, right? It's like it's a derogatory word toward Jews. Why would he go out? And I said, yeah, but he had a Jewish business partner. He had these Jewish aides. A lot of people need to realize, it's hard for people to understand this today, but Truman talked that way about everybody. I mean, there wasn't, the Irish he referred to as mix. I'm Italian. You wouldn't know it from my last name, but my mom's 100% Italian. He referred to Italians as dagos. Right? Right. I mean, he had a slang term for everybody. Although, actually, I don't think I ever saw him use any derogatory words about blacks. That's interesting.
Well, apparently, he used the N-word sometimes talking about people of color. But interestingly, he was the guy that desegregated the army, right. and supported right. civil rights. I mean, he lost support from a lot of his base because he supported civil rights.
Yeah, and see, people today have trouble wrapping their head around this. But when I tell them, I mean, I'm old enough to remember, right? Grandparents, great uncles, and everybody. People talked that way back then, and they told those kinds of jokes about all sorts of different ethnic groups, and then yet many of them would still treat people with dignity. And so in Truman's case, I try to tell people, no, it's not baffling, right? When he was a commander in World War I, he had a unit, was like, practically the United Nations, made up of every different type of ethnic group. And he would curse these guys, right? Making fun of the Irish, making fun of the Italians. But he would die for these guys, right? He would die for these guys. And so whatever statements he made like that about Jewish people, he had a business partner, Eddie Jacobson, and he did what he did with Israel. So he met with Chaim Weizmann. He met with Rabbi Isaac Halevi, and here's the other quote that I'll read from you because this is a jaw dropper. He said to Rabbi Isaac Halevi, Isaac Halevi Herzog said this to Truman. Mr. President, God put you in your mother's womb so that you would be the instrument to bring the rebirth of Israel after 2,000 years.
Wow.
Now, that's a stunning statement. And David Niles, who was sitting there, was a very cynical guy, said, I thought the rabbi was overdoing it, but I looked over and tears were streaming down Harry Truman's cheeks. So that got to him. And he did read his Bible, and he did understand the scriptures. And so for Truman, this was the right thing to do. He felt this was part of fulfilling God's destiny. And the quotes that I'm reading to you right now are from a chapter in my book on the faith of George W. Bush, and the chapter is called God and Democrats. And I laid all this out in that book because I said, liberals, Democrats, you want to beat up George W. Bush for invoking his faith all the time? Well, Democrats did this too, and they often did it for really good reasons. Yeah. Okay?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, Harry Truman was almost an accidental president. I mean, he wasn't even supposed to be vice president. In 1944, when FDR was running for his fourth and last term, if he had just taken his then vice president, Henry
Wallace.
Henry Wallace would have been his vice president for that fourth term, then would have become president of the United States. But Wallace was moved out. There were people that engineered Wallace's exit and brought in Truman as his running mate for that fourth term, and then Truman becomes president. So here's a guy who nobody thought was ever going to amount to much of anything. Failed in business, a senator from Missouri who people thought wasn't not particularly sophisticated, almost an accidental vice president, and he becomes president of the United States. Imagine that, president of the United States.
Yeah, and by the way, I will say here, thank God, literally, that Wallace was replaced because he was terrible. He was extraordinarily pro-Soviet. So much so that, just a total dupe on the Soviets. And in fact, it was the Wallace campaign for president through the Progressive Party in 1948. I've written about this in books on communism, that every communist in America flocked to. I mean, the entire CPUSA, Communist Party USA group, supported Wallace in 48 rather than the Communist Party ticket. So replacing Harry Truman was just I mean, literally thank God that happened. Now, Truman didn't see FDR much by the time that FDR died in April 1945, because he had only been president for a few, or vice president for a few months. But this too gets to the story of Truman's faith, Joe. Really, the first public expression of his faith as president. He is walking into the White House on April 3rd, 1945. FDR had just died. And he said to the press, he said, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. Pray for me now." Yeah. And he said, again, the farmer, right? He said, "I don't know if you've ever been hit by a bale of hay, but when I found out that Franklin Roosevelt died, it was like I was hit by the sun and the moon and the stars all at once."
Wow.
And because war was still going on in Europe at that point. Yeah. The Germans weren't going to surrender for another month. And Truman still didn't even know yet about the bomb, the Manhattan Project. FDR hadn't told.
Hold that thought, because that's like huge. Dr. Paul Kengor has written several books on the faith of leaders like President Ronald Reagan. You can check them out, of course, on our YouTube channel at joewatkins.org to view an episode we did on the president's faith. But he's also written about George W. Bush's relationship with God and even Hillary Clinton's understanding of faith. When we come back, I'll ask him about President Truman's faith and see how he views the Bible's influence on today's leaders. We'll be right back.
You're watching Joe Watkins' State of Independence on Lighthouse TV. Positively different. Share your comments about today's program in the comment box at joewatkins.org.
We're talking about President Harry S. Truman and his decision in 1948 to recognize the State of Israel, despite real opposition, even within his own government. Paul, this is incredibly interesting stuff, certainly to me, but I think to our viewers as well. Harry Truman, tell us about the decision that Harry Truman made to drop the bomb, two bombs actually, one in Hiroshima and one in Nagasaki.
Yeah, I mean, it was August 6th and 9th, 1945, that those two bombs were dropped. And when he became another of the most scandalous things that FDR did, all right, which is why I'm involved, Joe, in this ranking of presidents that C-SPAN does every few years. And FDR is always in the top three. I can tell you, I don't put FDR in the top three, all right? I rank Truman very high in these. But FDR as president, even though Truman had only been vice president for a few months, granted, he told him absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Nothing about his discussions with Stalin, nothing about Yalta, nothing about any of those things, and not even about the atomic bomb. So when Truman gets in and he's sworn in, one of the first people that called him over, why can't I think of Truman? Henry Stimson, FDR's Secretary of Defense. And Stimson said, "Mr. President," and Truman's like, "Huh?" Right? He said, "Yeah, you, Mr. President, I've got to tell you, I know you were on the Senate Military Preparedness Committee and so forth, but we're working on something really big, right? Like a secret bomb. And I need to tell you about this right away, sir." And again, Truman's just got this deer in the headlights look. They said, "You've had a tough day, sir. We'll talk about it tomorrow." And so he fills Truman in on this. And so Truman, right off, there's a great diary entry where he says something like, learn about the bomb, do this with Stalin, do this, do that, all a typical day in the life of the president of the United States. But so he learns about the bomb, and then he's got to decide whether or not to tell the Allies about it, which he had to do. He told Stalin about it. Stalin may have found out about it before Truman did, because of spies of the Manhattan Project, of all things. Told Churchill about it. And then decided that in order to compel the Japanese to surrender, because they weren't surrendering, even though we were dropping so many conventional bombs and incendiaries on Tokyo. I mean, we killed 100,000 people in Tokyo one night of bombings and conventional bombing raids. The Japanese would not surrender. They wouldn't surrender. So Truman decided, and these are Marshall's words. Marshall said, "We need to shock them into action. We need to do something really drastic to convince the Japanese to surrender." So they dropped the first one on Hiroshima, August 6th, and they had, Joe, I think they had 5 bombs altogether. And they waited 3 days to drop the next one on the 9th. Now, the next one was scheduled to go, I should have reviewed my notes on this before I came on, but the next one was scheduled to go in a couple days. Truman held off He held off. He said, no, let's give them more time to surrender. The Japanese war cabinet was divided still on whether or not to surrender. The emperor had to cast the deciding vote. So dropping the bomb did compel them to surrender. And of course, it was I'm sure an agonizing thing to do. But Truman said, look, if we invade, all right, we're going to lose hundreds of thousands of our boys, maybe 500,000, maybe 1 million. There's going to be millions of Japanese that die. And he was told by his advisors, including Oppenheimer, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project, that dropping the bomb would kill maybe like tens of thousands of Japanese. I didn't think he thought it would kill 200,000. Wow. But it did. But even then, Truman believed that would be, and it was, far lower than the number of people who would have died through an invasion.
Yeah, he was a man of great faith, and what a tough decision to make. Well, his name is, the man we're talking to is Paul Kengor, and that's his name. He's a longtime professor at Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania. He's a historian as well who writes vividly about the 20th century struggle between free people and communism and many of the figures who define that era. Dr. Kengor, thank you for being on State of Independence. Your insights on President Truman, by the way, and the founding of Israel were so incredibly helpful. History matters.
It does indeed. Thank you very much, Joe. And really, sincerely, thank you for addressing this subject. It's so important. Thanks so much. We'll be right back with our producer, Jeff Coleman, for closing thoughts.
Learn more about Joe Watkins and the mission of this program at joewatkins.net. And tell Joe what you thought about today's program in the comment box.
So now let's talk to our great producer, Jeff Coleman.
Well, a fascinating show. The Man from Independence.
Yeah.
Have you ever been to Independence?
I've not.
It's incredible because you see the humility of a person. You could go to Independence and you can see where Harry Truman walked every morning. He walked between his presidential library where he worked. He had a working office at the presidential library, and the home, which was his mother-in-law's home. And it's modesty, modesty, modesty throughout. And the trappings of the presidency never really changed Harry Truman, and I found today's show pretty encouraging.
Yeah, what an incredible man and leader. What tough decisions he had to make, huh?
Yeah, just innumerable.
Unbelievable. Well, the journey of a country and the story of people like you and me has one underlying theme. God's plan is unfolding every day. Scripture talks about God as the king or ruler of the universe. Everything is under his control. I hope today's program encouraged you to know that even when it's not clear to you, the plan is at work. In the meantime, it's our mission, wherever we are, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Imagine what could happen if that is how we lived. I'd love to have your feedback on today's show. Send me a comment in the message box at joewatkins.org. I read every one of them, and they're all so encouraging. Special thanks to my guest, Dr. Paul Kengor from America's first capital, Philadelphia. I'm Joe Watkins. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next week.
I'm glad Harry Truman's rankings have continued to go up.
Well, he's gotten more popular in death than he was in life.
Gary Sinise has a good movie about him.
When he left the White House, I think he was one of the least popular presidents.
Joe Watkins' State of Independence is a production of Lighthouse TV, positively different. Made possible in part because of the support of viewers like you.